Somewhere in northeastern China, in the middle of one of the most turbulent periods in human history, a man carefully lowered a skull into a well and walked away. Not a small skull, not something you could pocket or tuck under your arm. A massive ancient human skull, one of the largest ever found, and he told nobody. For 90 years it sat down there in the dark underwater, while the world above it tore itself apart and rebuilt itself from scratch. Wars were fought, empires collapsed, governments rose and fell. The man who hid it grew old and died, and still the skull waited. Think about that for a second. Whatever he saw in that skull was important enough to risk hiding it, important enough to keep secret. But what exactly was he protecting it from, and what did he know about what he'd found? That's the question that's been driving scientists absolutely crazy since this thing finally came back into the world, because when researchers actually got their hands on it and started running tests, they didn't just find an interesting fossil, they found something that genuinely challenges what we thought we knew about human evolution in Asia, about who was living where and when, and how many different kinds of humans were sharing this planet at the same time. Some researchers are calling it one of the most significant fossil discoveries of the century. Others are more cautious, and that tension between excitement and skepticism, between what the evidence shows and what we still can't prove, is exactly what makes this story worth telling carefully. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to piece this together the way scientists actually did, layer by layer, question by question. What was found? Who found it? Why it disappeared for nearly a century? What the bones actually tell us? And what, if anything, this single skull really means for the story of our species? Because the honest answer right now is that we don't know everything. The science is still unfolding, researchers are still arguing, and some of the biggest questions this skull raises might not have clean answers for years. But the questions themselves are extraordinary. And sometimes the most important thing a fossil can do isn't give you answers. It's make you realize the picture you had was missing something huge. Before we get into any of that, though, I want to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Drop it in the comments. Seriously, is one of my favorite things about making these, checking comments and seeing Tokyo at midnight, Cape Town at lunch, São Paulo just waking up. All of you in completely different worlds, all pulled into the same story. Tell me where you are. Now, let's go back to 1933, to a city on the edge of occupation, to a construction crew digging a bridge, and to the moment one worker looked down and realized he was holding something that had no business being there. Harbin in 1933 was not a quiet place. It never really had been. Sitting in the northeastern corner of China, right on the edge of where Manchuria bleeds into the Siberian cold, Harbin had been built fast and built hard by competing imperial ambitions. Russians had planted the city there in the late 1800s as a railroad hub, a strategic anchor for their expansion across the region. Then Japanese influence pushed in, then Chinese nationalist forces, then warlords. By the time you get to 1933, the city had already been through more political upheaval than most places see in 5 centuries, and it wasn't done yet. Just 2 years earlier, in 1931, Japan had seized Manchuria in a military operation that the rest of the world protested and then essentially accepted. By 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo had been declared, with the last Qing emperor installed as a figurehead, and Japanese military authorities running everything that actually mattered. Harbin had become a city where the people who lived there were no longer sure who they were living under or what the rules were from one month to the next. There were Japanese soldiers in the streets, Russian émigré communities who had fled the revolution and had nowhere else to go, Chinese residents caught between loyalties and survival, and everyone watching everyone else with varying degrees of suspicion. This matters. Not as background colour, but as the actual context in which this skull was found and in which the decision to hide it was made. When you're trying to understand why a person would drop something extraordinary into a well and stay silent about it for the rest of their life, you have to feel the weight of that atmosphere. The fear wasn't abstract. It was the kind you carry in your shoulders, the kind that makes you very careful about what you pick up and what you're seen with. The discovery happened during construction of a bridge over the Songhua River, which cuts through the heart of Harbin. The Songhua is a serious river, wide and powerful, the kind that demands serious infrastructure. Bridge work along waterways like this means digging deep, anchoring into sediment that in some places hasn't been disturbed for thousands of years. Workers were doing exactly that, cutting into the riverbank, moving earth, and exposing layers of ground that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Here's something worth understanding about places like this. River floodplains are almost accidentally perfect archives of the past. Every time a river floods, it deposits a thin layer of sediment over everything nearby. Do that enough times over enough centuries and you get a kind of geological layer cake, each stratum representing a different slice of time. Bones, tools, charcoal from ancient fires, all of it can end up buried not because anyone put it there deliberately, but simply because water keeps covering things and the ground keeps rising. Construction crews working along riverbanks and in deep urban foundations disturb these layers all the time. Ancient material surfaces constantly at sites like this, usually in fragments, usually unrecognized, usually scooped up and thrown aside without anyone realizing what they're looking at. So it was not strange, exactly, that someone digging into the Songhua riverbank might encounter old bones. What was strange was what those bones turned out to be. Now here's where we have to be honest about the limits of what we actually know. The specific details of the discovery, who found it, exactly when, precisely where along the riverbank construction was happening, what condition the skull was in when it came out of the ground, none of that has been verified with certainty. The story was passed down. It survived as family memory, eventually told by the finder's grandson decades later when the skull finally came back to light. That's not nothing. Family oral history can be surprisingly accurate about the broad shape of events, but it also can't be cross-referenced against contemporary records or independent witnesses, at least not fully. Researchers working with this skull have had to hold that uncertainty carefully, acknowledging that the discovery narrative is plausible and consistent with what we know about the time and place, while also recognizing that parts of it remain inferred rather than documented. What we can say with confidence is this. A skull was found in Harbin sometime around 1933 during construction activity near the Songhua River. It ended up in the possession of a Chinese worker. And he chose to hide it rather than hand it over. Why would someone do that? You have to think about what handing it over would have meant in that specific moment, in that specific city, under that specific occupation. Japanese authorities in Manchukuo were intensely interested in controlling any significant artifacts or discoveries within the territory. Something like this, an unusual ancient skull, would have been seen as potentially valuable, scientifically, symbolically, politically. There's a reason occupying powers tend to collect the heritage of the places they control. It's a form of authority. And a Chinese worker who produced something remarkable at a construction site was not likely to be rewarded with credit, recognition, or safety. He was more likely to simply lose the object to whoever had guns nearby and the inclination to take it. Hiding it was, in a certain logic, the most sensible thing he could do. And a well is actually a remarkably good hiding place, when you think about what it provides. Wells are enclosed, dark, waterlogged at the bottom, and typically accessed only by the household that owns them. Nobody casually searches a well. They're not places soldiers or inspectors tend to look. The constant water at the bottom keeps the temperature stable and cool, reducing the kinds of biological processes that would degrade organic material on the surface. The skull wasn't going to rot in there, it was going to wait, and it was going to be exactly where he left it whenever it became safe to retrieve it. Except it never quite did. That's the part of the story that sits with you. He apparently never told anyone, not during the occupation, not after the war ended, not when China reorganized itself entirely under a new government in 1949, not in any of the decades that followed. Either the right moment never came, or perhaps there was no version of events in which producing a strange ancient skull you'd been hiding for years felt like a safe thing to do, no matter who was in charge. So the secret became permanent. He carried it until he died, and the skull stayed in the dark. His grandson eventually told the story to scientists. That's how the trail got picked up. But by then, nearly 90 years had passed. The exact provenance of the skull was partially reconstructed from memory rather than record, and the skull itself had a story that was scientifically extraordinary, but contextually incomplete in ways that would matter enormously when researchers tried to interpret what they had. Think about what all of that means for the science. A fossil without a fully verified excavation record is a fossil that can't tell you exactly where it came from, stratigraphically, which is often the single most important piece of information you need to date it and understand its context. It's like finding a page from a book with no cover, no page number, and no table of contents. The words are right there. They're real. But figuring out where the page belongs in the larger story requires a completely different set of tools and a great deal more inference than anyone would ideally want. That's the situation scientists found themselves in when this skull finally came back into the world. Something clearly important, something clearly ancient, something with bones that didn't match any previously known category neatly, but wrapped in a discovery history that was partial, unverifiable in places, and shaped by the very specific chaos of a city that spent most of the 20th century under extraordinary pressure. Harbin in 1933 was not a quiet place, and what got pulled out of the ground there, whatever it was, has been making noise ever since. Imagine the moment of contact. A worker's tool strikes something solid in the earth, something that resists differently than packed sediment or river clay. He stops, he reaches down, and he pulls out a skull, not a fragment, not a scattered collection of broken pieces, a skull, essentially complete, the face intact, the brain case intact, the whole three-dimensional structure of a head that once held a living mind, sitting in his hands like something the ground had been deliberately keeping for him. The first thing anyone notices about this skull, the first thing every researcher who has handled it tends to mention, is the sheer size of it. It is large, measurably, substantially larger than a modern human skull in the dimensions that matter most, the brain case especially. When you pick it up, you feel the weight of it in a way that doesn't quite match your expectations. A modern human skull is lighter than most people assume. This one would not have given you that surprise. It would have given you the opposite feeling, the sense that you were holding something denser and more solid than you were prepared for. And the face is broad and flat and heavy-boned in a way that would register immediately as different, even to someone who had never studied a fossil in their life. This was not the skull of anyone walking around Harbin in 1933. That much would have been obvious from the first second. Now, put yourself in that worker's position. You're standing in a construction trench on the bank of the Songhua River, in a city that is not currently governed by anyone with your interests in mind. You are holding something that is clearly old, clearly unusual, clearly the kind of thing that the people in charge of this territory would consider worth taking. What do you do with the next 30 seconds? The options are actually fairly limited. You can call attention to it immediately, which means it leaves your hands almost certainly forever, absorbed into whatever institutional or military apparatus decides it wants it. You can quietly set it aside and try to figure out your next move, buying yourself some time to think. Or you can make a decision fast and commit to it, before anyone else sees what you're looking at. What seems to have happened, based on the account that came down through his family, is that he chose to take it. He removed it from the site, got it out of a context where it could be seen and claimed, and then faced the second problem that every person who has ever kept a secret faces immediately after deciding to keep it. Where do you put it? Here's what makes the well choice interesting. It wasn't an obviously sentimental decision, the kind of thing you do when you want to preserve something precious on a shelf. It was a practical calculation. He needed somewhere that was controlled, enclosed, unlikely to be casually inspected, and capable of keeping the skull physically stable for an uncertain period of time. A well near a private home checks every one of those boxes. It's not a place occupying soldiers walk past and search on a whim. It's not a place that gets cleaned out when a new family moves in. It's dark, it's cool, it's tucked into the domestic life of a single household, and it will be there tomorrow exactly as it was today. He wasn't hiding it forever. He was hiding it until the situation changed. But what was he actually protecting it from, and what was he hoping to do with it eventually? This is where the record goes genuinely quiet, and where we have to be honest about how much we're inferring. We don't know if he understood, in any formal sense, what he had. He didn't need a paleontology degree to recognize that this skull was strange and probably old. He would have known that, but whether he thought of it as scientifically priceless, or personally valuable, or dangerous to possess, or simply too unusual to hand over to people who would take it without explanation, we can't say. The motivation might have been fear alone. It might have been something closer to instinct, the sense that this mattered and that giving it away to the nearest authority felt deeply wrong. It might have been some combination of both, the kind of murky reasoning that real people apply to impossible situations in real time. What we do know is that the decision held, for decades, through the end of the Japanese occupation, through the chaos of the post-war years, through the transformation of China in 1949, through all of it, the skull stayed in the well, and the man who put it there stayed silent. That silence is the thing that actually changed the timeline of science, not the discovery itself. Discovery is just the moment the ground gives something up. It's what happens in the seconds and minutes after discovery that determines when the rest of the world gets to know. A different decision, one where he handed it to a supervisor or an authority, or even just showed it to the wrong person. And this skull potentially enters a scientific record in the 1930s, when the understanding of human evolution was profoundly different from what it is today, when the tools to analyze it didn't exist, and when the political turmoil of the following decade might have destroyed it entirely. The well, paradoxically, may have preserved both the skull and its scientific significance until the moment when the world actually had the capacity to understand what it was looking at. That's the strange gift of a hidden thing. It waits until you're ready for it. And when this skull finally came back to light, nearly 90 years after a worker wrapped his hands around it, in a trench along the Songhua River, the world it returned to was barely prepared even then. If you want to understand why the well worked, you have to think like a fossil, not like a person. For a person, a well is a functional object. It's where the water comes from. It's part of the background of daily life, so familiar you stop seeing it. For bone, especially old bone, a well is something different. It's an environment, a set of physical conditions that either destroy you or keep you almost perfectly unchanged. Start with the most basic one: temperature. The surface of the world is chaotic. In Harbin you get blistering summers, sub-zero winters, freeze-thaw cycles that turn soil into an expanding, contracting grinder. Above ground, those cycles attack bone relentlessly. Heat speeds up chemical reactions. Cold by itself isn't terrible, but the transitions are. Water in microscopic cracks freezes, expands, widens them, melts, seeps in deeper, freezes again. Do that a few hundred times, and what was once a solid skull turns into a network of fractures waiting to fall apart. Down in a well, especially an old stone-lined one, that violence gets muted. A few meters below the surface, temperature swings flatten out. Summer heat doesn't penetrate as deeply. Winter cold gets blunted. The air stays cool, the walls damp but steady. You move from a world of extremes to a world of averages. For bone, averages are mercy. Then there's light, or more precisely, the absence of it. Sunlight is energetic. It fades dyes, cracks plastics, breaks down collagen and fats in bone. Ultraviolet radiation especially is fantastic at snapping molecular bonds. Put a skull in a sunny courtyard for a few decades, and you can watch it crumble. Put the same skull in near-total darkness, and you take away one of the main drivers of chemical decay. Dark is not just secret. Dark is protective. And finally, disturbance. Every archaeologist quietly dreads one thing above all: later humans messing with earlier layers, ploughing, building, trenching, gardening, reusing the same patch of earth over and over until anything that used to be there is smashed to chalk dust. A shallow burial under a floor might last a few generations before someone remodels and scatters it. A box on a shelf can be thrown out when a family moves. But a functioning well, that's a special category. A well is infrastructure. Once it's established, people work around it. You don't casually fill it in or dig it out. You don't widen it just to see what's in the walls. You certainly don't drop things into it and then decide to drain and clean the entire shaft to satisfy your curiosity. The entire point of a well is its reliability. The less you have to mess with it, the better. So if you choose it as a hiding place, you're leveraging 3 silent guarantees at once. It will stay cool, it will stay dark, and for as long as anyone needs water, it will stay almost completely undisturbed. But that's the idealized physics of materials version. The reality is messier, and the messiness is where the luck comes in. Because wells are not dry vaults. They're dynamic systems. Water moves through them. So do dissolved minerals. Groundwater in many regions is carrying a constant load of calcium, iron, silica. As water levels rise and fall with the seasons, they wet and dry the walls of the shaft. Over time, those cycles can either entomb an object in protective deposits or quietly destroy it. If the skull sat above the standing waterline, resting in a niche, wedged on a ledge, or carefully wrapped and suspended, it would have been exposed mostly to humid air and occasional splashes. Enough moisture to keep it from becoming powdery and brittle, not so much that it dissolved. If, on the other hand, it spent years submerged, the story could have been very different. Bone immersed in water for long periods can leach minerals, soften, delaminate. Microbes in the water column can chew through what collagen remains. Fluctuating water tables can move silt and grit, grinding at surfaces, abrading important features. Then there are the minerals themselves. In some settings, mineral-rich water will begin to coat objects with thin veneers of calcite or other deposits, slowly building a protective shell. That can be fantastic for long-term preservation, but it also fuses things into place and obscures details. A skull encased in flowstone looks dramatic in a cave photograph. For researchers trying to measure subtle anatomical features, it's a nightmare. They either leave the mineral sheath on and accept that parts of the story will remain hidden, or they try to remove it and risk taking the original surface with it. The Harbin skull, by every account, is remarkably intact. The face is there, the vault is there, the delicate margins of the orbits and nasal aperture are not ground to featureless curves. That tells you something quietly remarkable about its time in the well. Whatever its exact position, it avoided the worst-case scenarios. It did not sit in a trickle of acidic water that etched away its surface. It did not get hauled up accidentally in a bucket and dropped back down to shatter on the stones. It did not become cemented in a stalagmite fortress. An intact, essentially complete cranium surviving decades in an active domestic feature, unbroken, unreported, and unlost, is not just clever planning. It's an improbable alignment of physics, chemistry, and human behavior. The worker made a smart choice. The well's conditions did the rest. But even with all of that working in its favor, the skull we have now is still an extremely lucky survivor. If that sounds unique, it isn't. Science is full of objects that survived history precisely because they slipped under its radar, tucked into places no one thought to look twice. Think about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Abandoned in caves by a religious community that probably intended to return, spent nearly 2,000 years in ceramic jars in stable desert microclimates, shielded from light, heat, and humidity. When Bedouin shepherds stumbled on them in the 1940s, they were suddenly catapulted into the center of arguments about early Judaism and the origins of Christianity. For almost 2 millennia they were just quietly existing in the dark, essentially in suspended animation. Or the terracotta warriors in Qiang, an entire imperial army buried and forgotten, waiting under farmland. Ordinary ground became a time capsule with a depth you could not guess from the surface. The same goes for shipwrecks buried under sediment, Bronze Age hoards stuffed into bogs, medieval documents used as binding material in later books. In each case, an object moves out of circulation into a stable, ignored niche, and that very act of vanishing is what lets it one day explode back into relevance. The well in Harbin belongs to this same family of accidental archives. To the neighbours living nearby, it was nothing. Just the place you drew water. To the man who dropped the skull down, it was a boundary between worlds, the visible one, where Japanese soldiers and later officials might appear at any moment, and the invisible one, where things entered and, for all practical purposes, stopped existing. There's a cost for that kind of safety, though, and you can see it every time a hidden object finally crosses back into the realm of science. Protection and secrecy come bundled with something researchers hate: missing context. Because while the skull was down there, the world was forgetting the details around it. The exact depth it came from in that construction trench, the precise sediment it was embedded in, whether there were animal bones around it, tool fragments, pollen grains, the names of supervisors on the site, the coordinates of the trench relative to the river. Every year that passed with the skull in the well and the story confined to a single family turned hard data into oral memory, and oral memory into hazy recollection. By the time the skull resurfaced, the basic outline was still there, found in the 1930s in Harbin by a man working on a bridge, hidden in a well on family land. But scientists working 90 years after the fact don't just want outlines. They want stratigraphy, associated fauna, radiometric samples from the layer it came out of. They want a chain of custody they can document in detail, not just trust. And secrecy is ruthless with that chain. The fewer people who know, the fewer witnesses there are to interview later. The more narrowly the secret is held, the easier it is for key links to vanish as generations pass. The very thing that saved the skull from confiscation and possible destruction also stripped away most of the auxiliary information that would have made its age and original setting straightforward to reconstruct. When paleoanthropologists talk about the Harbin skull now, this is the tension they're always navigating. On one side, the extraordinary anatomical preservation, the sense that the bone itself is telling you something crisp and important about a kind of human we barely knew existed. On the other, the blurred edges of its biography, the missing coordinates, the unsampled sediments, the fact that the first 80-plus years of its time above ground were lived entirely off the scientific grid. So how does something that secret, that off-grid, finally come back? Not by accident. For an object like this to reappear, you need a very particular kind of chain of custody, one that works more like a relay race than a straight line. Someone has to care enough not to throw it away. Then someone else has to care enough to keep the story attached to it. Then, at some point, someone in that chain has to decide that silence has done its job and it's time to hand the thing over. In the case of the Harbin skull, that decision came nearly 9 decades after the worker first lowered it into the well. By then, most of the original actors were gone. What remained were the object itself, the family memory of its hiding, and a world of scientists who, without knowing it, had been getting ready for precisely this kind of surprise. When the skull finally climbed back out of the dark, it didn't just bring new anatomy into the light, it dragged that entire invisible history with it. The occupation, the fear, the decades of domestic secrecy, the physics of a Chinese well, the narrow path a fragile object can follow through time if enough small decisions go its way. And once it was out, once it was in a researcher's hands instead of on a family shelf, the well ceased to be the important part of the story. The question shifted. Not, how did this survive, but what exactly have we been missing all this time? To answer that, the skull had to leave the world of private hiding places and enter the world of X-rays, CT scanners, comparative collections and competing hypotheses. It had to stop being a secret and start being a specimen. That transition, out of the well and into the lab, is where the story picks up again. When the Harbin skull finally did make that transition, it didn't burst into the world with press conferences and journal covers. It came back the way it had disappeared, quietly, through family. The story the current researchers tell goes something like this. The worker who found the skull in 1933 never stopped knowing it was there. He lived through the war, through the civil conflict that followed, through the founding of the People's Republic. While regimes rose and fell around him, the skull stayed put. Eventually he left Harbin and moved farther south. The well, the bridge, the immediate danger of Japanese soldiers faded into the background. But before he died, he passed the secret on. Not to the state, not to the local museum, to his children. They inherited not just an object, but a responsibility they hadn't asked for. In their version of the story, the skull was retrieved from the well at some later point, brought into the house, wrapped, boxed, shifted through a series of family moves. It spent years in attics and under beds, a strange heirloom with an even stranger origin. Imagine being that next generation. You know, because your father told you that this thing came from deep old Earth, that it might be important in a vague, undefined way. But for most of your life, China is a place where private relics and unusual bones are not obviously safe topics to bring to officials. So you do what the previous generation did. You keep it quiet, you keep it close, you wait. By the early 21st century, the ground had shifted again. Chinese universities were expanding their research programs. Paleontology and human evolution were no longer fringe pursuits run by a handful of specialists. They were national-scale enterprises. New fossils from places like Dali, Jinyushan, and Zhujiao were making headlines. There was a context now, a scientific conversation, into which an odd, oversized skull from Harbin could plausibly fit. Somewhere in that window, researchers say around 2018 to 2019, the family finally made their move. They brought the skull to a Beijing university. Not to a random person on the street, but to a place that, in their eyes, represented expertise and maybe at last safety. From the outside, that looks like a simple handoff. Old object, new owners. In reality, it's the most precarious moment in the specimen's entire history, because once the cardboard box opens in an academic office, the rules change. Family legend, however sincere, isn't enough anymore. Universities and museums operate under a different set of instincts. They've been burned too many times by amazing finds that turned out to be fakes, composites, or heavily altered curiosities. So before anyone gets too excited, there's an internal checklist that starts quietly ticking in the background. Where exactly did this come from? Who has handled it? What's the paper trail? With something like the Harbin skull, those questions don't have neat answers. There's no excavation permit number, no field notes, no stack of old photographs showing the trench and the layer. Just a family, a story stretching back to the 1930s, and a piece of bone that looks to a trained eye both spectacular and problematic. So the first job of the scientist is not to classify the fossil, it's to decide whether they can trust it at all. Museums and universities have developed a kind of triage for this. Step 1 is simple. Look at the thing. Up close. Really close. Is the coloration consistent with known fossils from the region, or does it look artificially stained? Are there modern tool marks on the bone where someone might have improved a fragmentary edge? Do the fracture patterns and weathering stages make sense for a skull that was once buried in sediment and then spent decades in a relatively stable human environment? Under magnification, fake patinas tend to give themselves away. Modern glues fluoresce. Plaster fills look different from mineral intrusions. Even without fancy equipment, an experienced preparator can spot amateur reconstruction work. In Harbin's case, the examiners saw something crucial. A surface that behaved like authentic ancient bone. Microcracks, mineralization, abrasion in all the right places and in the right sequence. Then come the scans. CT imaging tells you whether the internal structure matches what you'd expect from a Pleistocene cranium. Is the diploa, the spongy bone between the inner and outer tables of the skull, preserved? Are there density gradients that suggest long-term burial and mineral replacement? Or does everything look strangely homogeneous, the telltale sign of a modern replica? Again, the Harbin skull passed. Its internal anatomy lined up with genuine fossil hominins. The sutures, sinuses, the thickened brow region, they all looked real. There were no supporting wires, no poured cores, no hidden rods. At that point, the conversation shifts from, is this a hoax, to, okay, but how much can we really know about it? This is where documentation, or the lack of it, starts to bite. In an ideal world, every fossil human skull is anchored in a web of context. You have its exact geographic coordinates. You have the stratigraphic column from the site showing which sedimentary layer it came out of. You have bags of associated fauna and microfauna, rodent teeth, antelope bones, mollusk shells, each with their own dating potential. You might even have charcoal for radiocarbon, or volcanic ash layers suitable for argon-argon dating. With Harbin, almost all of that is gone. The family could point to Harbin as the general area. They could repeat what their father had said. It came from sediments under a bridge project in the 1930s, near the Songhua River. But they couldn't walk scientists back to the exact trench. The construction site had been altered, rebuilt, paved over. No one had scooped up the surrounding sediment and stored it in labelled bags. No one had logged its depth in meters below the modern surface. To a paleoanthropologist, that's like being handed a crucial paragraph ripped from a book, with all the page numbers torn off. The words are there, but you don't know where in the story they belong. So when the Harbin skull arrived in the lab, the first professional reactions divided along a predictable fault line. On one side, awe. Here was one of the most complete, massive human crania ever found in East Asia. Thick-boned, with a huge brain case, enormous brow ridges, a low but long vault. Features that seemed to echo some known fossils, Dali, Jinyushan, even the Sujiayo remains, yet combined them in a way nobody had quite seen before. For scientists who had spent careers staring at fragmentary jaws and isolated teeth, this was like suddenly being handed a nearly complete face from a ghost population. On the other side, skepticism. How old was it? The family said pre-1940s, which only told you when it was found, not when the individual had lived. Could it be tens of thousands of years old? Hundreds of thousands? Without a stratigraphic anchor, every age estimate would rest on indirect lines of evidence, bone chemistry, regional geology, comparison to other fossils. And beyond age, there was the more basic question, where exactly did this thing fit? Was it an unusually robust member of a known species, a northern variant of early Homo sapiens, a late surviving archaic human, a Denisovan? Those are not the kinds of questions you answer by gut feeling. They're the kinds you answer with measurements, comparative samples, and as much context as you can scrape together from a reluctant past. Around the specimen, the institutional machinery started moving. Accession numbers were assigned. Documentation of the handoff was written up. Every detail of the family's account was recorded, not because anyone assumed it was false, but because oral histories get fuzzy at the edges and future researchers would need to see where the firm ground ended and the reconstructions began. Curators and administrators also had to grapple with a more philosophical issue. How do you treat an object that is, simultaneously, a priceless scientific resource and an heirloom someone's father risked a lot to protect? You don't just strip away the story and keep the bone. You fold the human biography into the specimen record. The occupation, the hiding, the decades of silence. It all becomes part of the file, part of what later scholars will have to weigh when they cite Harbin cranium in their own work. Still, no amount of careful paperwork could solve the central scientific problem that loomed over everything. In paleoanthropology, context is not decoration. It's half the data. A skull is not just anatomy, it's also time, place, and association. Was this individual living alongside mammoths or water buffalo? Did its layer sit below or above a known volcanic ash horizon? Are there stone tools nearby that look like a particular technological tradition? All of that helps you anchor it in the broader story of human evolution. Harbin arrived stripped of almost all of that scaffolding. It was a floating point in space, a face and brain case without coordinates. So from day one, every researcher who held it in their hands was juggling two contradictory impressions at once. On the one hand, this is one of the most significant human fossils ever to appear in China. On the other, it comes with less field documentation than some Victorian cabinet curiosities. That tension set the stage for everything that followed: the debates, the new dates, the bold claims about new species, and the equally forceful pushback from other scientists. Because before anyone could argue about what to call this skull, they first had to figure out what, in the strictest sense, it actually was. And that turned out to be much harder than anyone expected. You can't resolve that just by staring at it. You need chemistry. You need microanatomy. You need comparisons to every vaguely similar skull in every major collection. You need to squeeze as much information as possible out of a specimen that brought almost nothing with it except itself. Which is exactly what the next part of the story is about. The attempt to turn a context-poor skull into a well-dated, well-understood node in the human family tree, and the surprises that fell out of that effort. When you strip away the family story and the missing paperwork, what you're left with is bone. And in paleoanthropology, bone is language. It's how a skull tells you who it might have been. Harbin's skull speaks with a very peculiar accent. Start with the first thing anyone notices, that brow ridge. In modern humans, the brow region is there, but it's broken up. It's a series of subtle arches over each eye, often interrupted in the middle, more like two hills with a little saddle between them. In the Harbin skull, that whole area is fused into a single massive bar of bone. It runs straight across the forehead like a shelf, thick, continuous, powerful, the kind of supraorbital torus we usually associate with much earlier, much more archaic humans. Under that brow, the orbits themselves are big. The eye sockets are tall and wide, giving the face a kind of deep-set, almost oversized look around the eyes. That's a clue, because orbit size and shape vary across human species and across time. They're part of the pattern you use to say, this looks more like X than Y. Move down from the brows and you get to the face as a whole. It's wide. Not just a little broader than average, but proportionally expansive, with zygomatic bones, the cheekbones, flaring out to create a broad mid-face. At the same time, the upper jaw doesn't project forward like in some very early Homo species. It's not a flat vertical face like most modern humans, but it's not a snout either. It sits somewhere in between. Then there's the cranial vault, the brain case. This thing is big. When you reconstruct the missing parts and run the numbers, you get an estimated brain volume in the same range as, or even higher than, many modern humans. But the shape of the vault isn't like a modern globular skull. It's long and low, stretching back behind the face, more like what you see in Middle Pleistocene humans, elongated with the highest point of the skull more toward the back than toward the front. Put all that together, and you have a weird combination. A thick, heavy brow and robust face that look old, paired with a large cranial capacity that looks surprisingly modern. This is the basic puzzle of Harbin. Every major region of the skull is saying something, but they're not all saying the same thing. To make sense of that kind of mixed message, scientists don't just stare and shrug. They measure. A human skull in a lab becomes a collection of landmarks, distances between points, angles of curves, the height of the face, the breadth of the vault, the degree of projection of the nose and jaw. Researchers use calipers, 3D scanners and CT data to generate dozens, sometimes hundreds of numbers: cranial length, cranial breadth, frontal chord, parietal arc, orbital height, nasal width. On their own, those numbers don't mean much, but when you compare them across large samples, modern humans, Neanderthals, earlier Homo erectus, other Middle Pleistocene fossils from Asia and Europe, patterns start to show up. Some groups cluster tightly, others occupy their own corners of what anthropologists call morphospace, the map of shapes and sizes that different populations can take. With Harbin, a lot of those measurements fall outside the variation of any one well-known group, or sit right at the extreme edge. The brow is more robust than most known East Asian fossils. The vault size is on the upper end for archaic humans. The face is broad in a way that recalls some other Chinese fossils, Dali, Jinyushan, but the combined set of traits doesn't match any one of them neatly. That's the part that makes some researchers lean forward in their chairs. Because in paleoanthropology, doesn't fit neatly is where new things often lurk. But here's where we have to pause and draw a critical line. Looking different is not the same thing as being different. Every species has internal variation. Modern humans are a perfect example. Think about the range of skull shapes you'd get if you lined up individuals from across the world. Differences in brow size, nasal width, facial breadth, vault shape. If you didn't know they were all the same species and you only had a handful of skulls, you might be tempted to divide them into multiple kinds of humans. So when a fossil looks strikingly odd, there are two basic possibilities. One, you've caught an extreme member of a known population, a statistical outlier, a very robust male, or someone whose traits sit at one end of the bell curve. Two, you're looking at a representative of a distinct lineage, something that, over hundreds of thousands of years, followed its own evolutionary path and accumulated a consistent set of differences from other groups. Distinguishing between those two possibilities is hard. It's even harder when you have one skull, because with one specimen, you don't know the shape of the bell curve. You don't know whether Harbin is in the middle of its group's variation or out on the fringe. All you know is that, compared to other fossils we have, it looks unusual. That's part of why the debates around Harbin get so heated. Some scientists look at the measurements and say, this could be a particularly robust member of a broader East Asian archaic human population, maybe related to what we sometimes call archaic Homo sapiens or Homo heidelbergensis. Others argue that the pattern of traits is coherent enough and distinct enough to justify talking about a separate evolutionary branch. And there's another concept lurking in the background that complicates everything: mosaic evolution. We tend to imagine evolution as a smooth gradient from primitive to modern, with all traits shifting together. In reality, different parts of the body can evolve at different rates, under different pressures. You can have a very modern-looking skull vault sitting on a more archaic face, or a robust brow ridge paired with a brain size well within modern ranges, or, in some Neanderthals, inner ear structures that look modern while the rest of the cranium looks anything but. Harbin is a classic mosaic. Ancient and modern traits are mixed together in one individual. The massive, continuous brow and thick cranial bones point toward an archaic overall construction. The large brain volume and some aspects of the midface contour look more like late Middle Pleistocene or even early modern humans. Some features echo what we know or suspect about Denisovans from their DNA, and from a handful of fragmentary remains. Others line up more comfortably with regional Chinese fossils that predate Homo sapiens. Mosaic evolution means you can't just pick one feature and let it dominate the story. You can't say, big brain, therefore modern, or thick brow, therefore ancient. You have to look at combinations of traits, and how often those combinations appear together in time and space. This is why scientists spend so much energy on multivariate analyses, statistical methods that treat a skull not as one thing, but as a bundle of dimensions. They ask, where, in this multidimensional trait space, does Harbin actually sit? Does it cluster with Neanderthals, with earlier Asian fossils, with modern humans? Or does it carve out its own cluster, overlapping a bit with others, but not really belonging to any? The initial work on Harbin suggested that, in this morphometric space, it tended to group with some other puzzling Asian fossils: Dali, Jinyushan, possibly Hualongdong. Together, they seem to form a loose constellation of large-brained, robust-skulled humans in Pleistocene China that don't look exactly like Neanderthals and don't look exactly like early Homo sapiens either. That's intriguing. It hints at a long-lived, regionally distinct lineage in East Asia. Maybe even one that could be linked to Denisovans, whose DNA we have but whose faces we barely know. But again, this is where caution has to slam on the brakes. Because a single skull, no matter how spectacular, is both a gift and a trap. It's a gift because it preserves an enormous amount of information compared to the usual fragments. It lets you see the overall architecture of a head, the way different parts of the skull fit together. It can anchor comparisons, reframe older finds, and suggest new connections between sites and regions. It's a trap because humans are pattern-seeking animals. When we see something striking, our first instinct is to build a story around it, to name it, to give it a place, a label, a neat narrative, a new species, a lost branch, a missing link. But evolution is rarely that tidy, and the fossil record is brutally incomplete. Whole populations can vanish from the geological record, leaving behind only a tooth or a jaw. Others are overrepresented for no better reason than that their bones fossilized under fortunate conditions. Harbin arrives with no known skeleton, no associated teeth, no clear sight, no direct neighbours in the sedimentary column. It might be the best preserved face of an entire Asian lineage. It might be an unusually robust individual from a broader, more ordinary population. Right now, based purely on anatomy, it could plausibly be either. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It's the price of honesty when you're trying to reconstruct deep time from a handful of bones. So when you hear bold claims about the Harbin skull, new species names, sweeping statements about our closest relatives, sweeping counterclaims that it's nothing special, it helps to remember the tightrope everyone is walking. On one side, if you're too conservative, you risk missing real important evolutionary splits, smoothing over genuine diversity into a vague, unhelpful, archaic humans bucket. On the other, if you're too eager to split, you start assigning every odd skull to a brand new species, and the story of human evolution fragments into a confusing, artificial taxonomy that doesn't reflect how populations actually changed and mixed. Harbin sits right at that fault line, anatomically rich, context poor, and wearing a face that looks both familiar and utterly strange. To push beyond what anatomy alone can tell us, researchers needed more lines of evidence, geochemistry, rare isotopes, subtle traces in the mineralized bone that could hint at when this person lived and what kind of world they inhabited. Because if you can't rely on the ground it came from, you have to squeeze time itself out of the skull, and that turns out to be an even more delicate operation than reading its shape. If you have a fossil in perfect context, dating it is almost boring. You have a skull still half buried in a clearly defined layer of sediment. You date that layer directly, maybe you've got volcanic ash above and below, maybe you've got well-understood fauna in the same horizon. You bracket it in time and say, this individual lived sometime between here and here. It's never exact, but the logic is straightforward. Harbin is the opposite of that. Here we have a spectacular skull and a family story, a bridge site that might be the original location, a well, some rumours. What we don't have is the thing paleoanthropologists crave: documented stratigraphic context. No one marked down, found in layer X, 15 centimetres above layer Y, under a lens of gravel we know from other sites is around 300,000 years old. The skull was lifted out of time before science ever saw it. That means dating Harbin becomes indirect and probabilistic. You can't just point a machine at the bone, hit analyze, and get a calendar date. You have to build a case from clues, each one uncertain on its own, but together forming something like a probability cloud around the truth. The first clue is always, where did it probably come from? Investigators went back to Harbin, talked to surviving relatives and locals, tried to reconstruct where the bridge was being built in 1933, which gravel pits were used, which sediment layers were exposed. They identified candidate deposits along the Songhua River, places where a skull like this could plausibly have been scooped up with the construction materials. But plausibly is not definitely. So instead of one clean stratigraphic line, you get a set of likely source deposits, each with its own age estimate. Right away the dating problem turns into a probability question. If the skull most likely came from this cluster of sediments, and those sediments are somewhere between X and Y years old, then Harbin must be in that range too. That's stratigraphic inference. You're not dating the bone itself. You're dating the world it was probably buried in. To tighten that up, you look at the sediment still clinging to the fossil. Even a cleaned specimen usually preserves microscopic traces of the matrix it fossilized in. Mineral grains lodged in tiny cavities, thin films of sediment in cracks. Under a microscope and in a geochemistry lab, those grains become fingerprints. Grain size, mineral composition, particular mixes of quartz, feldspar, heavy minerals, even the orientation of microscopic scratches, all of that can be compared to candidate deposits in the field. If the silt stuck inside Harbin's nasal cavity matches a particular layer along the riverbank, that strengthens the case that this is where it came from. Again, not proof, but a better probability. Once you've linked skull and sediment as best you can, the next step is to ask, how old are those deposits? Here's where radiometric dating enters the picture, but with important limits. Most people have heard of radiocarbon dating, the method that looks at the decay of carbon-14 in organic material. It's powerful, but it has a hard upper limit. After about 40 to 50,000 years, there just isn't enough carbon-14 left to measure reliably. Beyond that, the signal dissolves into noise. Harbin is clearly much older than that. The anatomy alone tells you we're in the Middle Pleistocene, hundreds of thousands of years ago, well outside radiocarbon's reach. So you turn to other clocks. One common strategy is to date the rocks around the fossil rather than the fossil itself. If there are volcanic layers, ash falls, lava flows, associated with the sediment, you can use isotopes with much longer half-lives. Argon-argon dating, for example, measures the decay of potassium-40 to argon-40 in volcanic minerals and can reach back millions of years. Uranium lead-in zircon crystals is even older. In many Pleistocene sites there is no handy volcanic timestamp. Then researchers lean on other radiometric systems. Optically stimulated luminescence, which estimates the last time mineral grains were exposed to sunlight. Electron spin resonance, which tracks trapped electrons in tooth enamel or carbonates. And uranium series methods, which look at how radioactive uranium decays into thorium within minerals over time. Uranium series dating becomes especially interesting when you have bones. Fresh bone doesn't start out with much uranium. Over time, groundwater percolating through sediment carries uranium into the porous bone, where it's absorbed. Once it's locked in, the uranium decays into daughter isotopes, like thorium-230. By measuring the ratio of parent to daughter isotopes in the bone, you can estimate when that uranium uptake happened, essentially when the bone was buried and started its radioactive clock. But it's not as clean as it sounds. Bones are open systems. They can keep taking in or losing uranium long after death. If the burial environment changes, different groundwater chemistry, new fractures, the clock can reset or smear out. To handle that, scientists don't just grab one measurement and call it a day. They sample different parts of the bone, run models of uranium uptake, and try to bound the likely age with upper and lower limits. With Harbin, researchers combined uranium series data from the skull with similar analyses on carbonate deposits in nearby sediments. They weren't getting a precise birthday. They were getting a no younger than, and probably not older than framework. Something like, the uranium-thorium ratios tell us this bone has been closed to significant uranium movement since at least X thousand years ago, and the surrounding deposits, constrained by independent methods, suggest a broader window around Y. On top of the radiometric angles, there's comparative dating, lining up Harbin against other fossils and faunal remains whose ages we know better. If the sediment matrix and associated fauna, bits of mammal bone, pollen grains, fossilized plant material, match a well-dated Pleistocene assemblage elsewhere in northern China, that's another piece of the puzzle. Certain extinct animals only appear in particular time slices. If you find Harbin's sediment-sharing species with deposits securely dated to, say, 300 to 400,000 years ago, it's unlikely your skull is, say, 100,000 or 800,000. The ecological context acts as a coarse clock. The morphology itself also becomes a kind of comparative timer. No one wants to say, the skull looks like X, therefore it must be exactly Y years old, but there are broad patterns. Some cranial architectures disappear after certain periods, others don't show up until later. If Harbin's traits match a cluster of fossils that radiometric methods place around a certain interval, and diverge strongly from both older and younger morphologies, That gives you another independent reason to prefer a particular age range. In Harbin's case, all these lines of evidence converged on a Middle Pleistocene age, on the order of a few 100,000 years old, often discussed in the rough neighbourhood of 140 to 300,000 years, with many researchers favouring somewhere in the mid to later part of that window. Not a single sharp number, but a band of time. And that's really the main thing to understand about dating a fossil with missing context. You almost never end up with a single date. You end up with ranges and confidence levels. Radiometric methods give you numbers with error bars. This layer is 260,000 years old, plus or minus 30,000. Stratigraphic inference gives you brackets. The skull must be older than the sediment that buried it, but younger than the erosion surface beneath. Comparative evidence gives you likelihoods. Given how this skull looks and what's around it, it's most consistent with this part of the Pleistocene, less consistent with these other parts. Scientists then stack those constraints. If multiple independent methods all point to roughly the same slice of time, confidence goes up. If they disagree, you dig deeper, literally and figuratively, into what might be skewing the results. Maybe the bone is contaminated. Maybe the sediment has been reworked by a river. Maybe the uranium uptake wasn't a simple one-time event. And because all of these methods are built on assumptions about closed systems, steady decay rates, undisturbed layers, revisions are normal. New techniques can remeasure old samples with finer resolution. Re-examination of a site can show that a deposit once thought to be undisturbed is actually a mix of older and younger material. When that happens, the age of a fossil can shift, sometimes dramatically, without anyone having lied or cheated. The underlying models just got better. So with Harbin, when you see numbers printed in papers or mentioned in documentaries, it's worth remembering what those numbers really are. Carefully argue probabilities tied to specific methods and assumptions. They are not eternal truths etched into the bone. They are our current best attempt to pin a face to a moment in deep time, knowing that the pin might move as the evidence improves. Dating a fossil with missing context is less like reading a timestamp and more like reconstructing the time on a shattered clock. You gather the fragments, compare them to other clocks, run the physics in reverse, and accept that you'll end up with a window, not a second. But even a window can be transformative. Knowing roughly when Harbin lived tells you which other human populations were around, what the climate was doing, what animals roamed the plains of Northeast Asia. It lets you ask new questions. Who were this person's neighbours? What lineages might they have met, or merged with, or competed against? To answer those questions, though, you need one more thing. Not just when Harbin lived, but how closely they were related to us, to Neanderthals, to Denisovans. And for that, bones alone are no longer enough. You have to try something even more ambitious, to pull molecules of ancient information out of a skull that spent hundreds of thousands of years turning into stone. If you work on Ice Age bones from Europe, you get a little spoiled. Caves in cold, dry climates are basically cryogenic freezers. Bones slip into the sediment, the temperature stays low, the microbes slow down, and some of the DNA just hangs on. Not much, not intact, but enough that with modern sequencing you can sometimes pull millions of fragments out of a single tooth. Harbin is not that story. We're talking about a skull that lay in the open at least long enough to be spotted on a construction site, then sat in a well for decades, after already spending hundreds of thousands of years in the ground. Heat cycles, moisture, microbes, oxygen, mineralization, every one of those is a tiny attack on DNA. Imagine taking a book and leaving it in the rain, then baking it in the sun, then dunking it in a swamp, then slowly replacing the ink with rock. A few letters might survive, maybe scraps of words. But expecting full sentences is optimistic. That's what ancient DNA is up against. The first problem is simple chemistry. DNA is not a stable molecule over geological time. The backbone breaks, bases fall off, strands snap into shorter and shorter pieces. Crosslinks form between fragments so the chain can't be read. After a few tens of thousands of years in bad conditions, you're basically down to biochemical confetti. The second problem is biology. When something dies, microbes move in. Bacteria and fungi chew through tissues, including any remaining DNA, replacing it with their own. Groundwater brings in even more microbial DNA from the environment. The older the fossil, the more layers of biological noise are smeared across whatever original signal is left. The third problem is us. Modern humans are walking bags of DNA contamination. Skin cells, sweat, saliva, shed hairs. The moment someone in 1933 picked up the Harbin skull with bare hands, they were adding their own genetic signature on top of whatever ancient molecules might still have been there. Decades in a well. More opportunities. Handling in museums before strict cleanroom protocols. Even more. So when scientists talk about trying to get DNA out of Harbin, they're really battling three enemies at once: time, environment, and modern contamination. You can't just scrape the bone, toss it in a sequencer, and assume the results belong to the person who died 200,000 years ago. You have to separate out human from non-human DNA, ancient from modern, genuine fragments from lab and field contamination. That's why expectations are low. Middle Pleistocene fossils from temperate Asia are already long shots for genetic work. Add in Harbin's chaotic recent history and the odds drop even further. It's not that DNA extraction is impossible in principle. It's that every factor you'd want to be favourable is, here, stacked the other way. So what do you do when the gold standard fails? You start looking for other molecules that are tougher than DNA but still carry evolutionary information. Enter proteins. Proteins are the workhorse molecules of life, chains of amino acids folded into complex shapes. They're coded by genes, but once they're built, they're often more chemically robust than DNA. In particular, certain structural proteins in bone and tooth enamel can survive far longer, sometimes into time periods where DNA is basically gone. This has given rise to fields with names that sound like science fiction: paleoproteomics, paleoproteomics, ancient proteomics. Whole labs devoted to pulling trace proteins out of fossils and reading their amino acid sequences like messages from the deep past. It works because evolution leaves fingerprints not just in DNA sequences, but in the proteins those sequences encode. Change the gene, and you often change the amino acid sequence. Change the amino acids, and you can, in principle, detect that difference even when the original DNA is dust. Enamel proteins are particularly promising. Tooth enamel is the hardest tissue in the human body, highly mineralized and relatively resistant to chemical breakdown. In some early Homo fossils, researchers have used enamel proteins to place specimens on the human family tree when DNA was long gone. They've been able to say, this isn't a modern human, this isn't a Neanderthal, this is something branching earlier, based purely on tiny variations in protein sequences. Collagen, the main protein in bone, can preserve as well. Its sequences evolve slowly, but even subtle shifts can reflect deep splits between lineages. Combined with sophisticated mass spectrometry, collagen peptides can become phylogenetic characters, just like skeletal traits or DNA bases. So for Harbin, even if the classic ancient DNA route fails or yields only noise, it's not necessarily the end of the molecular road. Proteins and peptides offer a backup channel, less detailed than genomes but still informative. Enough, potentially, to answer the biggest question hanging over this skull. Who, genetically, was this person? Right now, without clean DNA, relationships are argued mostly from shape. The Harbin skull has a mosaic of features: massive face, big brow ridges, huge molars, but a brain case and some details that don't match classic Neanderthals, or early Homo sapiens, or anything else perfectly. Some researchers see affinity with other Chinese fossils like Dali or Jinyushan and group them as a distinct lineage. Others suspect it could be close to Denisovans, the ghostly human species we mostly know from DNA extracted in Siberia and Tibet. That's where genetics, if we could get it, would be like turning on the lights in a dark room. Suppose we pulled authentic ancient DNA from Harbin and aligned it with known genomes. If it clustered tightly with Denisovan sequences, the ones from Denisova Cave in Siberia and the high-altitude specimen from Siahe on the Tibetan plateau, that would strongly support the idea that Dragon Man is part of the Denisovan clade. Suddenly, the mysterious Denisovan face we've never seen would have a candidate skull. If, instead, Harbin turned out to be most closely related to Neanderthals, that would be a surprise. The anatomy doesn't scream classic Neanderthal, but DNA sometimes reveals close relationships under unexpected morphologies. We've already seen that. Individuals who look morphologically intermediate but turn out, genetically, to be F1 hybrids between Neanderthals and Denisovans. A Neanderthal-leaning Harbin would force a rethink of how variable that lineage really was, especially in East Asia, or it could fall out closest to us. If Harbin grouped near the root of the Homo sapiens branch, it might represent a sister lineage to modern humans, part of a broader, now extinct diversity of archaic Homo in East Asia that sat close to our own line. That would feed into debates about whether there were regionally structured populations feeding into our ancestry, or whether our story really is a clean recent African origin with only limited admixture from archaic groups. And there's a fourth possibility people don't like to talk about because it complicates everything. Harbin could represent a lineage that doesn't map cleanly onto any known group, a branch related to, but distinct from, both Neanderthals and Denisovans, a cousin of cousins. That wouldn't rewrite the idea that multiple human lineages existed. It would underline it. Asia, already looking crowded with overlapping Homo species, would get even more complex. But here's the catch. Until we actually have those molecules, all of this is conditional. No DNA, no proteins, no clean phylogenomic signal. None of that is proof that Harbin wasn't Denisovan, or wasn't Neanderthal related, or wasn't connected to our own story. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when you're working with extremely fragile molecules on fossils this old, from environments this harsh. The failure to find DNA can mean lots of different things. Maybe the preservation was just too poor. Maybe the sample you drilled happened to be from a heavily mineralized area with no surviving organics. Maybe the contaminant load is so high that the ancient signal is buried below detection thresholds. Maybe, with better techniques 10 years from now, material we'd currently write off as dead will suddenly become readable. Proteins have their own caveats. Not every specimen preserves them. Not every protein gives enough phylogenetic resolution to distinguish between, say, Denisovan-like and non-Denisovan archaic Homo. Interpreting ancient proteomes is still a young science. The more we learn, the more we realize that diagenesis, post-mortem chemical alteration, can scramble signals in ways that aren't fully understood yet. So when scientists say, we don't have DNA from Harbin, they're not saying we know Harbin has no genetic relationship to known groups. They're saying our current tools haven't yet pulled a clear signal out of this piece of bone. That's a much more modest and much more honest statement. Even so, the genetic frame matters, because we're not just trying to label one skull. We're trying to reconstruct an entire social and evolutionary landscape across Ice Age Asia. We already know, from living people's genomes, that Denisovan DNA is scattered across modern populations, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. We know Neanderthal DNA is in almost everyone outside sub-Saharan Africa. We know there were multiple episodes of interbreeding, modern humans mixing with Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, with Denisovan-like groups somewhere in Asia, Neanderthals and Denisovans mixing with each other at least once, probably many times. That means that when Harbin was alive, Asia wasn't a blank map waiting for modern humans to arrive. It was a patchwork of human lineages, some deeply archaic, some Denisovan-like, some late Neanderthalish, some maybe already trending toward our own form. Rivers, mountains and climate zones would have carved out semi-isolated pockets, but not total separation. Group boundaries were porous. People met, traded, fought, and had children. Genetics is how we glimpse that ghostly network. Every time we connect a fossil to a known lineage, Neanderthal, Denisovan, or some new branch, we're not just adding a dot to a family tree. We're filling in the cast list for a continent-wide drama of contact and mixture. We're learning who could have met whom, who might have shared tools or songs or pathogens or myths. Harbin sits right in the middle of that stage geographically and chronologically. If one day its bone yields even a sliver of readable molecular data, DNA or proteins, that sliver could decide whether we see this skull as a Denisovan cousin, a separate Asian lineage, a close relative of our own species, or something stranger still. Until then, we're operating with half the script. We have the face, the age, the environment. We can imagine the world this person walked through, but without genetic ties we don't yet know which branch of the human experiment they embodied, or how their people fit into the tangled web of lineages that crisscrossed Ice Age Asia. To get at that, we have to step beyond molecules and back into anatomy and archaeology, into the messy business of deciding where Harbin belongs on the human family tree when the DNA refuses to speak. So, where do you put a giant, oddly shaped skull on the human family tree when the DNA won't tell you? You start by admitting there are multiple competing stories on the table. One option is the bold one. Harbin represents a distinct archaic species. Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal, not any named group we've already agreed on, but a separate branch that split off hundreds of thousands of years ago and followed its own path in East Asia. That's the logic behind the name Homo longi that some of the describing authors proposed. New genus, new species, a new twig on the tree. Another option is more conservative. Harbin is a regional variant within a broader archaic population. Maybe it's part of a widespread northeastern Asian lineage that also includes skulls like Dali, Jinushan, Hualongdong. They share some traits: big faces, thick brow ridges, fairly large brains, combinations of features that don't quite match Neanderthals or us. Instead of each one being a separate species, they might be local flavours of the same long-lived population, adapted to slightly different climates or lifeways. And then there's the possibility that Harbin actually belongs to a group we already know about, just seen here in an unusual form. That's where Denisovans enter the picture. Denisovans are the ghost people of human evolution. We have whole genomes from a finger bone and a few teeth in Siberia, and from a jaw on the Tibetan plateau, but almost no complete skeletons. Genetically, they're a sister group to Neanderthals, closer to each other than either is to us. But anatomically, we're mostly guessing. The Siahi mandible from Tibet, probably Denisovan, has a robust jaw with massive molars, some primitive traits, some Neanderthal-like hints. The Denisova cave molars are enormous. That's not a lot to go on. So when the Harbin skull appears with its huge teeth, low but capacious brain case, thick brow ridges and a massive broad face, people start to connect the dots. Northeast China, roughly the right age, living in a region where later Denisovan-like ancestry shows up in modern genomes. Massive molars, like the Denisova cave teeth. A face that doesn't match classic Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens. You can see why, maybe this is Denisovan, is tempting. Some researchers argue exactly that. They point to the combination of archaic features, big face, powerful jaw, huge teeth, with some derived traits that don't fit Neanderthals. They run morphological analyses comparing Harbin to Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, known Asian archaic skulls, and find that it clusters closer to the Dali-type fossils and by inference maybe to Denisovans. But by inference is doing a lot of work there. The problem is we still don't have a definitive, fully associated Denisovan skull to serve as a reference. We know their DNA. We know a handful of jaws and teeth. We don't know for certain what a typical Denisovan cranium looked like. That means any anatomical comparison is partly circular. We see a big-toothed, robust Asian skull and say, this looks like what we imagine a Denisovan should look like. That's a guess, not a test. It gets messier. Other specialists point out that Harbin also shares features with early Homo sapiens in East Asia, and with some late Middle Pleistocene African fossils. Some traits of the brain case and cheekbones look surprisingly modern. So is it Denisovan-like? A sister lineage to modern humans? A long-lived, regionally structured population that was exchanging genes with both? Without molecules, morphology alone can't cleanly cut those knots. This is where taxonomy, the science of naming and classifying life, comes in, and it's less settled than textbooks make it sound. In theory, naming a new species should be straightforward. You identify a set of diagnostic traits that no other known species has in that particular combination. You show that those differences likely reflect deeper evolutionary separation, not just normal variation within a species. Then you publish a formal description, give it a name, and if your colleagues agree, that name sticks. In practice, with fossil humans, almost every step of that process is controversial. First, what counts as a diagnostic trait? A thick brow ridge? Plenty of Homo species have that. A big face? Same problem. Even complex combinations can show up independently in different lineages, what biologists call convergence. Second, how do you tell species-level differences from regional or temporal variation within a single, widespread species? Modern humans vary a lot in skull shape. So did Neanderthals. If we only had a handful of skulls from our own species, scattered across continents and separated by hundreds of thousands of years, we might easily split them into multiple species that, in reality, all interbred. Third, different experts weigh traits differently. One team might focus on the shape of the brow ridge and nasal aperture. Another might prioritize the angles of the cranial base or subtle features of the inner ear. Feed different characters into your analysis, and you can get different trees. That's why you see such different headlines after big fossil announcements. One group says, "New human species discovered." Another paper comes out a year later saying, "No, this is just an odd Neanderthal," or "just a regional Homo sapiens variant." Both are reading the same bones, but through different taxonomic philosophies. Harbin is caught right in the middle of that debate. The naming team argued that its mix of characters justified a new species, Homo longi. Critics counter that the skull shares many traits with other Chinese Middle-Late Pleistocene fossils, and that we don't have enough evidence yet to carve all of those into discrete species. Some would prefer to treat them as an archaic Homo population in East Asia, potentially including Denisovan-like groups, without overcommitting to Latin names. Underneath the labels, though, is a more important question. What does Harbin do to the story? Whatever name you slap on it, a skull like this forces you to rethink timelines. If Harbin is Denisovan or closely allied to Denisovans, it immediately expands the known Denisovan range, both in space and in anatomy. It would mean Denisovan-like populations weren't just lurking in caves in Siberia and high plateaus in Tibet. They were big-faced, large-brained people spread into northeastern China, perhaps for hundreds of thousands of years. That would change how we imagine the encounters between these groups and incoming Homo sapiens later on, and it would sharpen the picture of where the Denisovan DNA in modern people actually came from. If, instead, Harbin represents a separate archaic Asian lineage, neighbouring Denisovans on the tree but not identical, it means Ice Age Asia wasn't just a two-species stage of Neanderthals to the west, Denisovans to the east. It was a mosaic of overlapping lineages, Neanderthal-related groups in some regions, Denisovan-like in others, plus at least one big-faced, big-brained eastern clade represented by Harbin and its cousins. That would push us toward models where modern humans leaving Africa encounter not one archaic neighbour in Asia, but several. And if Harbin sits closer to the stem leading to Homo sapiens, if it's part of a broader, near-modern cloud of populations that ringed the old world before fully modern humans appeared, that feeds into a different narrative, one where our species emerges from a tangled network of semi-connected groups, rather than a single, clean ancestral population. Harbin would then become evidence of that network reaching deep into East Asia, long before the classic out-of-Africa expansion 60,000 years ago. In every scenario, the skull is a timeline anchor. Its age, its geography, its mixture of old and new features all constrain what kinds of migrations, contacts and adaptations were happening in this part of the world. That's why the stakes in the classification debate feel so high. It's not just about the right Latin name, it's about which story of human evolution this fossil seems to support. Amid all of this, it's important not to oversell certainty. What's compelling about Harbin is clear. Its massive, well-preserved face and brain case, its clear differences from classic Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, its similarity to other enigmatic Chinese fossils, its placement in time, when multiple human lineages were likely coexisting across Eurasia. What's actively debated is whether those differences justify a separate species name, whether its closest relatives are Denisovans, Dali-type skulls, early Homo sapiens, or some combination, and how much of its anatomy reflects deep evolutionary separation versus local adaptation and normal variation. What we genuinely still need is more data. We need more fossils from northeastern China with good stratigraphic context, and, ideally, better organic preservation. We need clearer molecular signals, DNA if we get lucky, proteins if we don't, from Harbin itself and from its putative relatives. We need more detailed comparative studies that put Harbin side by side, metric by metric, with Xijun, with Dali, with Neanderthals, with early Homo sapiens from Africa and the Levant. Until that happens, every interpretation comes with a giant asterisk. Calling Harbin Homo longi is a hypothesis. Calling it probably Denisovan is a hypothesis. Calling it an archaic Asian Homo near the split between Neanderthals, Denisovans and us is another hypothesis. All of them are attempts to fit one very strange skull into a family tree that we know is bushy, tangled, and incompletely sampled. That uncertainty isn't a failure of science. It's the honest state of knowledge when you're working with fragmentary bones from hundreds of thousands of years ago. What Harbin really does, right now, is push us to accept that our picture of human evolution in Asia is still badly underexposed. We can see just enough to know there were more branches on the tree than the 3 headline species, We can sense multiple lineages crisscrossing the continent, leaving genetic traces in us and physical traces in fossils like this one. To understand what that world actually looked like, not in theory, but in lived detail, we have to zoom out from classifications and think about landscapes, climates, and neighbours. Because whatever Harbin's exact label turns out to be, it wasn't alone out there. Start with the world you'd see if you stood where that skull once stood. Northeast China in the late Middle Pleistocene wasn't the frozen wasteland people imagine when they hear Ice Age. It was a shifting patchwork. Glacial cycles drove the climate like a slow, irregular heartbeat. Cold phases pushed steppe and open grassland south. Warmer interglacials pulled forest back in. Big rivers, the Proto-Songhua, the Amur system, wandered across broad floodplains, cutting new channels, abandoning old ones, filling low spots with lakes and marshes. On the higher ground you'd have had a mosaic. Ribbons of riparian woodland along rivers and streams, pockets of mixed forest on sheltered slopes, open steppe and parkland in between. Winters would have been bitter, with deep snow and long stretches of sub-freezing temperatures. Summers were short but productive. Herds of deer, wild horse, maybe steppe bison, elk, and woolly rhino would move through the open ground. In the forests, boar, smaller deer, and a whole community of small game, birds, and edible plants. Harbin's people, whoever exactly they were on our family tree, were living on the edge of that mosaic. Not in a single habitat, but in the seams between them. Those seams matter. Steppe forest boundaries concentrate resources. You can hunt grazing animals in the open, then retreat to wooded areas for fuel, shelter, and other foods. Rivers add fish, waterfowl, and predictable travel routes. If you know how to read this kind of landscape, it's a buffet. If you don't, it can kill you inside of one bad winter. Surviving that world required an integrated toolkit, not just strong bones and big teeth. Clothing wasn't optional. In these latitudes, even during relatively mild phases, naked apes don't last. We don't have fossilized parkas, but we do have indirect clues from across Eurasia. Cut-marked animal bones showing systematic skinning, stone tools ideal for scraping hides, and, later on, bone awls and needles. Those technologies don't appear out of nowhere at 40,000 years ago. They sit at the end of a long, invisible ramp of experimentation. So picture Harbin's people in layered skins and furs, maybe not tailored in the way Upper Paleolithic sewing allowed, but wrapped, folded, and tied. Hoods and mitt-like coverings, foot wrappings insulated with dry grass, hide belts and thongs to secure everything, basic functional clothing that extended the range of where a group could survive, how long they could stay out hunting, how deep into winter they could push their luck. Shelter was the next non-negotiable. Caves, where available, are obvious refuges, and we know that other Pleistocene humans in northern Eurasia used them extensively. But Harbin's region is also rich in loess deposits and easily worked sediments. That opens the possibility of semi-subterranean houses, pits dug into the ground, lined with wood and brush, roofed with branches and hides, insulated with earth and snow. Archaeologists find these kinds of structures at later sites in cold steppe Asia. Again, the full-blown versions show up late, but the logic behind them would have been attractive much earlier. Even temporary windbreaks and lean-tos could mean the difference between life and frostbite. A group moving along a frozen river might throw up a quick shelter of poles and hides, cluster inside, and let a central hearth do the rest. Because fire wasn't a luxury, it was the center of the system. Controlled fire use goes back hundreds of thousands of years, probably to our common ancestors with Neanderthals and Denisovans. By Harbin's time, fire mastery wasn't new, but the stakes were higher at this latitude. It dried wet hides and clothing, cracked open marrow-rich bones, turned hard roots edible, and sterilized water. It chased away predators that would happily test a camp full of sleeping primates. It hardened wooden spear tips. It created light in the 16-hour nights of midwinter, turning dark hours into time for tool-making, food processing, and social interaction. And it demanded planning. Stockpiling wood before snow buried everything, knowing where to find dry kindling in a storm, carrying embers from camp to camp when ignition was difficult. These are not instinctive behaviors. They are cultural skills, taught and refined. Hunting in that world wasn't just one person with a pointy stick chasing a deer. Large prey in open steppe and patchy forest require coordinated strategy. Think of a small band, maybe 20-30 individuals like we talked about earlier in Africa's bottleneck, but here in a northern Asian setting. The core would be long-term kin, but the hunting party might be made up of the most able-bodied from several nearby bands. Some would scout animal movements along river corridors, reading tracks and dung and subtle cues in vegetation. Others would position themselves downwind along likely paths. Taking down a horse or a deer in open ground with handheld spears is risky, so groups learn to shape the battlefield, driving animals toward bottlenecks, river bends, gullies, patches of dense brush. Some would shout, throw stones, beat sticks, flush the herd. Others waited where the terrain forced the animals to slow or turn. A successful kill meant not just meat, but bone, sinew, hide, fat, and marrow, an entire toolkit's worth of raw material. Sharing that payoff fairly was as important as getting it. When winters are long and hunts can fail, you don't want to be in a band where one unlucky week means your kids starve while your neighbour feasts. Cooperative hunting only works if the benefits are widely distributed. That implies norms, expectations, maybe obligations, who gets which cuts, how meat is stored, who's taken care of when they're injured or old. Those unwritten rules are as much a survival technology as a spear point. Now layer something else on top of this survival framework: neighbours. We tend to picture Pleistocene Asia as territorial blocks. This area belongs to Denisovans, that area belongs to Neanderthals, this one is for early Homo sapiens. The reality was almost certainly messier. Rivers like the Amur and the Yellow didn't just channel animals, they channeled humans. Different groups could have followed the same migration corridors at different times of year, or in different climatic phases, or separated by centuries. Over tens of thousands of years, those movements blur into overlapping ranges. In some periods, Harbin-like populations might have been the main game in town across northeastern China and the bordering plains. In colder phases, Neanderthal-related groups pushing east could have probed into similar territories from the west. Denisovan-like groups, adapted to a variety of habitats from Siberian forests to high plateaus, might have occupied more continental interiors or broken up mountain flank environments to the south and west. Those distributions weren't static. Climate pulses would push one lineage out of marginal zones and open them to another. A valley that was dominated by one population for a few millennia could see a different group move in when glaciers advanced or retreated. Over enough cycles, the same landscape might host 3 or 4 different kinds of humans at different times, and now and then at the same time. When those overlaps happened, the outcomes wouldn't always be dramatic battles. Sometimes people probably skirted each other, avoiding conflict. Sometimes they competed directly for the same herds and shelters. And sometimes we know from genetics they met closely enough to have children together. The Xijun jaw on the Tibetan plateau shows Denisovan-like features high in the mountains. Harbin and Dali-type skulls show robust, big-faced humans on the northern plains. Farther south, sites in Southeast Asia record early Homo sapiens, and living people in those regions carry Denisovan ancestry. In some northern populations today, you find tiny traces of Neanderthal-related DNA that likely came from even older contacts in Eurasia. You can think of all this as 3 separate stories: the Neanderthal story, the Denisovan story, the Homo sapiens story. That's the textbook version. Or you can think of it the way glaciologists think about rivers. A single river flowing from the mountains to the sea rarely keeps the same channel. It splits, it braids, it rejoins. One strand cuts a new path around a gravel bar, another dries up in a drought. During a flood, several channels merge into a single roaring flow. From above, you see a network, not a line. Human history in Ice Age Asia looks more like that braided river than a subway map with clean, non-overlapping lines. Take the Dali skull in central China. Some researchers see it as part of the same broad population as Harbin, big-faced, large-brained, archaic, but with hints of modernity. Then add the Jinyushan and Hualongdong fossils, again with their own mixes of traits. Fold in Xiahe on the plateau, Denisova cave in Siberia, later early Homo sapiens finds in northern China and Mongolia, and the scattered genetic footprints of all these groups in living people from Tibet to Oceania. What emerges isn't a tidy succession. First Denisovans, then Harbin-like archaics, then modern humans. It's a set of partially overlapping populations, sometimes isolated, sometimes mixing, sometimes disappearing entirely and leaving only their genes behind in someone else's descendants. In that view, the Harbin skull isn't the representative of a neat, bounded species territory. It's a snapshot from one channel of that braided system at one moment in deep time. Its particular combination of traits, robust face, big brain, archaic features alongside more modern ones, captures the way evolution, climate, and social behavior were interacting in this region. It tells us that northeastern Asia wasn't waiting passively for Homo sapiens to arrive with superior technology and cognition. It was already full of humans who had mastered fire, clothing, shelters, and complex cooperation. Humans who had weathered multiple glacial cycles. Humans who, in some scenarios, were close kin to Denisovans, in others, related to early branches of our own lineage, in still others, part of a long-lived, regionally distinct population. When you see the story that way, the question, exactly what species is Harbin, becomes less the endpoint and more the starting condition. The real shift Harbin forces is conceptual. Ice Age Asia stops being the quiet side stage where a couple of side characters linger until modern humans show up. It becomes a crowded, dynamic arena, a place where multiple human streams braided together, diverged, and braided again, long before anyone painted on cave walls in France or carved ivory in Germany. And once you accept that braided river picture, another realization follows. If the landscape was that complicated, if so many groups were sharing and reshaping the same spaces over hundreds of thousands of years, then one skull in a well can't just tweak our diagrams. It can change how we argue about the whole script. From here you can probably guess what happened next. Paleontologists didn't all gather in a circle, look at the Harbin skull, and nod in quiet agreement. They argued. They are still arguing. And if you understand why, you understand something important about how science actually works. Start with a basic rule that almost every scientist in every field will sign off on: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Slightly unusual fossil turns out to be slightly unusual member of a known group is not an extraordinary claim. We have discovered a fourth major kind of human, co-equal with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. And this single skull finally shows where Denisovans fit on the tree very much is. The Harbin team didn't just describe a skull. They proposed a new species, Homo longi, and suggested it might represent our closest extinct relatives, maybe even the mysterious Denisovans, based on anatomy alone. That's a huge leap. It might end up being right in some form. But for a lot of researchers, the key question wasn't, is Harbin interesting? It obviously is. The question was, have you really built a strong enough chain of evidence to support the story you're telling? That chain has multiple links. You need a solid geological context. Where the skull came from, which layers, which sediments, what else was there? Harbin doesn't have that. It came out of a construction site in the 1930s, was hidden in a well, and only resurfaced in the 2000s and 10s. The team used clever geochemistry and comparisons with nearby sites to narrow down its age, but there's still uncertainty. You need comparative anatomy, detailed, replicable measurements showing how this skull differs from other fossils. The original description does this, but critics want more than one lab's interpretation. They want independent teams to run their own analyses, with access to the same raw data. You need integration with genetics and archaeology. If you're going to say, this is Denisovan adjacent, or this is our closest sister lineage, you want DNA, or at least proteins, or at the very least, a tight fit with what we already know from Denisova Cave, Xijun, and living people's genomes. Right now, Harbin doesn't give us that. Each missing or weakened link in the chain doesn't make the fossil useless. It just lowers how far you're allowed to push the claims if you're playing by strict scientific rules. But those aren't the only forces acting on a fossil story. For better or worse, fossils live in the human world, not just in the ground. And the human world has politics, nationalism, institutional rivalries, media cycles, and personal ambition. Harbin is a perfect example. For most of the 20th century, narratives about human evolution were written largely from Europe and North America, based heavily on African and European finds. Asia appeared as a side chapter, Peking man, a few scattered sites in Siberia and the Levant, a Denisovan pinky bone in a Russian cave. Chinese researchers have been pushing back against that Euro-African focus for decades, arguing that East Asia was not a passive cul-de-sac but a central arena of human evolution. That's not propaganda. The fossil record really does show deep, complex human presence across China. So when an exceptionally well-preserved skull emerges from northeast China, in a scientific environment keen to highlight its own importance, the stakes are high. Naming it Homo longi, dragon man, isn't just taxonomy. It carries cultural weight. It says, here is a major lineage on our turf that the rest of the world has to reckon with. On the other side, some Western researchers look at this and see a pattern they're wary of. A rush to declare new species based on limited material, wrapped in national pride, amplified by headlines that talk about rewriting human history every other week. They worry that this inflates claims, confuses the public, and makes the whole field look less rigorous. That doesn't mean Harbin's describers were lying, or that critics are jealous. It means everybody in this story is human. They operate in systems that reward big, bold claims and media attention. They work in environments where funding, prestige, and international status attach themselves to fossils like barnacles. Then there are the very practical turf wars. Who gets to name a fossil? Traditionally, whoever publishes the first formal description with a clear diagnosis. But what if the fossil has been known locally for decades? What if other teams were circling it, preparing their own papers? Speed begins to matter as much as care. Who controls access? CT scans, surface models, physical specimens. These are scientific gold. If access is tightly controlled by a small cluster of institutions, critics will ask whether alternative interpretations are being suppressed, even if the actual motives are more mundane. Bureaucracy, conservation concerns, the slow pace of building trust between labs. Who gets to repeat the measurements? Skull thickness, vault shape, face projection, inner ear morphology. These aren't one-button outputs. Different measurement protocols can produce slightly different results. Reproducibility is crucial. Without independent teams checking the numbers, disagreement can harden into camps. Our dataset versus your dataset. This is where the tools of modern science can either pour oil on troubled waters or add fuel to the fire. CT scanning is a revolution. It lets researchers peer inside bones without damaging them, reconstructing brain cases, sinuses, tooth roots, and internal structures. Digital models can be shared around the world in seconds. In principle, that should democratize analysis. A skull in one museum can be studied by a grad student half a planet away. In practice, it comes down to policy. Are the CT datasets made openly available, or only to select collaborators? Are they released quickly, or after years of sitting on a server? Are the file formats standardized, or locked in proprietary systems that require expensive software? Open data tilts the game toward consensus. When many eyes can examine the same digital skull, obvious mistakes get caught. Rogue interpretations that can't survive contact with the raw geometry fade away. If several independent groups run different statistical analyses on Harbin and converge on similar conclusions, that's evidence the community can trust. Peer review is another filter, but it's not a magical gate that only lets truth through. The Harbin papers were peer-reviewed before publication. That means they were scrutinized by a handful of experts chosen by editors. Those reviewers may have raised objections, suggested changes, or accepted arguments that later critics found unconvincing. Peer review is a check against obvious errors and wild claims, not a guarantee of final correctness. What happens after publication, replication, reanalysis, critique in follow-up papers and at conferences matters just as much. If a dramatic fossil claim survives a decade of sustained attack from specialists armed with better scans, more data, sharper methods, it gets promoted from interesting possibility to working consensus. A lot of Homo longi's journey is still in that middle zone. Some researchers think it's a valid, distinct lineage. Others fold it into a broader Eastern archaic Homo population that includes Dali and Jinyu Shan. Some tie it strongly to Denisovans. Others say that's premature until we have molecules. While they hash that out, the media often races ahead. Giant dragon man skull rewrites human history as clickable. New Chinese fossil adds nuance to ongoing debates about Middle Pleistocene population structure in Northeast Asia is not. You live at the receiving end of that distortion. So here's a simple toolkit for reading the next big fossil headline, whether it's Harbin, or something pulled from a Siberian cave, or a jaw found in the Andes. First, look for context, not just claims. Does the article mention how many specimens the new species is based on? One skull? A few teeth? A dozen individuals? The smaller the sample, the more cautious the conclusion should be. Second, watch the verbs. Suggests may represent is consistent with signal that the authors are trying to be careful. Proves, shows definitively, upends everything we thought we knew, should make you lean back and ask, really? Based on what? Third, check for integration across fields. Are genetics, archaeology, geology and anatomy all pointing the same way, or is the claim hanging from a single line of evidence? Harbin, right now, is mostly anatomy plus indirect dating. That's fine, but it sets a ceiling on how grand the story can be. Fourth, see how other scientists respond. If you only hear from the discovery team, you're seeing half the conversation. Robust science survives critical commentary. If multiple independent experts say, this is exciting, but we're not ready to call it a new species yet, that's not negativity. That's the system doing what it's supposed to do. Fifth, track time. Real revolutions in understanding don't happen in one paper and one news cycle. They unfold over years as more fossils are found, more genomes sequenced, more sites excavated. If a headline says rewrites human history this week, and you never hear about that fossil again, odds are it didn't. When you apply that toolkit to Harbin, you get a mixed picture. Yes, it's an extraordinary skull. Yes, it forces us to expand our mental map of Ice Age Asia. Yes, it probably does belong to a population we hadn't properly recognized before. But no, one skull, however impressive, doesn't by itself rewrite human history. It edits a paragraph, maybe a chapter, in a book that many authors are still drafting. And there is one more reason scientists argue so fiercely about fossils like Harbin. Behind the technical debates about taxonomy and phylogeny sits a much more personal question. Who are we, and how many ways have there been to be human? If Harbin represents a long-lived Northern Asian lineage that survived brutal climates, developed complex survival strategies, and sometimes shared genes with our own ancestors, then the answer is, there have been more ways than we used to think. That's a profound shift. It spreads us out across more branches of the tree. It suggests that our story is not a straight line of progress, but a tangled history full of side paths that were just as clever, just as tough, and, for a long time, just as successful as the branch that led to you. What would it take for a single skull to truly rewrite that story, not just tweak it? To do that, it would have to show us something we didn't even know to look for. To get there, we need to be clear about what rewrite human history actually means. In the way it's usually used in headlines, rewrite sounds like, throw the old book in the trash, start again from a blank page. That almost never happens. In real science, rewrite is almost always editing. You move a branch on the family tree, you slide a date back 50,000 years, you add a new migration route, or a new episode of interbreeding, or a new technology appearing earlier in one region than anyone expected. The old story doesn't vanish, it gets rearranged. Whole paragraphs are crossed out, others are penciled into the margins, some are moved from the footnotes up into the main text. Harbin, at least so far, lives in that world of edits. It nudges our sense of how many kinds of humans were in Ice Age Asia, how big and robust some of them were, how they might have coped with cold environments. That's important. But it doesn't yet force us to say, everything you learned about human origins is wrong. However, if some of the bolder interpretations of Harbin and its cousins eventually hold up, then we are looking at changes that are more than just cosmetic. Take the Denisovan question. Right now, Denisovans are mostly a genetic ghost. We know them from tiny fragments, a finger bone and a few teeth from Denisova cave, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau, and from their fingerprints in our genomes. They're everywhere and nowhere at once, like a character you keep hearing about in a story but never actually meet. If it turns out that Harbin, Dali, Jinyushan, and a cluster of other Chinese fossils all belong to a single, coherent Denisovan-grade population, that would be huge, because it would take Denisovans out of the shadows. Instead of a mysterious hybrid of DNA and broken molars, they'd become a visible, named, anatomically described species with faces, brain cases, and a geographic range that covers half a continent. We'd be able to match particular features, huge molars, thick brow ridges, long low skulls, massive bodies, to particular genetic lineages in living people. That would rewrite the way we visualize the human family in the late Pleistocene. Not a vague third kind of human off in Siberia somewhere, but a dominant Northern Asian lineage that met, mixed with, and possibly outcompeted other humans over hundreds of thousands of years. Or push the claim further, suppose Harbin really does represent a distinct species, not just a regional variant. Suppose Homo longi holds up, not as a rebranding of Denisovans, but as something parallel to them, a fourth major branch alongside Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. Suddenly, Ice Age Eurasia goes from a triangle to a web. You don't just have Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans in the east, and Homo sapiens wandering through late in the game. You have multiple large-brained, technologically capable human species overlapping in space and time, each with its own ecological niche, its own body plan, its own cultural traditions. They're not guests on our stage. We are one newcomer among many. Now imagine geneticists managed to tease out fragments of ancient DNA or proteins from a Harbin-like skull, and those molecules don't sit neatly on the Denisovan branch. They split deeper. They show that East Asia hosted a long-lived lineage that diverged from the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans, before those two even parted ways. That would drag a whole hidden chapter of our story out into the light. It would tell us that for hundreds of thousands of years, there was a fourth experiment in being human, running in parallel, probably contributing genes to us, possibly handing over adaptive tricks for cold resistance, immune function, or metabolism. And we never recognized it because we've been trying to squeeze every skull into 3 boxes. Or take migrations. Right now, the standard storyboard looks roughly like this. Modern humans evolve in Africa, spread out in pulses starting around 200 to 70,000 years ago, encounter and interbreed with Neanderthals and Denisovans, then eventually displace them. If Harbin and related fossils end up being securely older than that, genuinely Middle Pleistocene, say 300 to 400,000 years or more, and clearly close to us rather than to Neanderthals, that suggests something more radical. It would hint at earlier, now mostly vanished, expansions of our lineage or near relatives deep into Northern Asia. Not just little scouting parties that fizzled out, but substantial durable populations that left big bones and big skulls behind. Tie that to genetic hints of ghost populations, archaic humans that contributed DNA to us but aren't Neanderthals or known Denisovans, and you start sketching a very different picture of our past. Not one big out-of-Africa sweep, but repeated waves. In, out, overlapping, blending, sometimes being pushed back, sometimes leaving fragments of their genomes in isolated modern groups. Harbin, in that scenario, becomes one of the physical anchors for those invisible migrations. Those are the kinds of shifts that deserve the word rewrite. Not because they erase what came before, but because they force us to rethink the structure of the whole narrative. How many actors, how many acts, how many entrances and exits. To move from maybe to this really happened, though, you need evidence that goes far beyond an impressive skull and a clever press release. First, you need rock-solid context. That means a skull found in a layer of sediment whose age you can bracket tightly with multiple dating methods. It means knowing exactly which river terrace, which volcanic ash, which glacial cycle you're dealing with. Ideally, it means associated tools, animal bones, pollen, a whole little time capsule that says, this is the world this human lived in. Harbin doesn't give us that. It was pulled from the ground by workers, hidden for decades, separated from its deposit. That makes its age and surroundings inherently fuzzy, no matter how smart the geochemical tricks are. Second, you need numbers, more bones, more individuals. One skull can be a weirdo. Every species, every population throws up outliers, unusually big, unusually small, unusually robust. When you find half a dozen skulls with similar features across different sites and layers, it stops looking like a quirk of individual variation and starts looking like a pattern. You also want bodies, not just heads. Pelvis, limbs, vertebrae, hands, feet. Robust skull plus delicate body is a very different creature from robust skull plus powerlifter skeleton. That difference changes how you interpret their ecology, their behavior, their relationships to other humans. Third, you want molecules. Ancient DNA is the gold standard, but it's fragile and doesn't preserve well in warm, wet environments. Proteins, especially tooth enamel proteins, last longer. Either one can tell you where a fossil actually sits on the genetic family tree, who it shared ancestors with, who it interbred with, how long ago its lineage split off. If a Harbin-like skull yields Denisovan DNA, the debate shifts overnight. If it yields a distinct, deep diverging lineage, the stakes go even higher. If it yields nothing at all, then proteins from associated teeth, or even sediments, might still give you hints. Finally, you need convergence: anatomy, geology, genetics, archaeology, all pointing broadly the same way. Different teams, in different labs, running different methods on overlapping datasets, and arriving at compatible stories. That's when a controversial interpretation starts to harden into the new normal. Getting there is slow, unglamorous work. It means more field surveys in northeast China and across Central and Eastern Asia, systematic searches of river terraces, cave systems, old quarry sites. It means going back into local collections, provincial museums, even private stashes, looking for overlooked skull fragments or jaws that might belong to the same population as Harbin. It means building big, open comparative datasets, CT scanning every relevant fossil, from Africa to Europe to Asia, and letting researchers test whether Harbin truly clusters apart, or whether its features fall on a continuum with other archaic humans. It means refining dating methods for tricky contexts, better luminescence techniques for sediments, better uranium series and ESR for teeth, better models that integrate regional climate records, cave growth layers, and river histories. And it means pushing biomolecular techniques to their limits, improving protocols for extracting proteins from tiny ancient samples without contamination, experimenting with sediment DNA in Chinese cave sites that haven't yet yielded fossils, but might preserve genetic traces of the humans who passed through. Under all of that, there's one constant: the oddly fragile, oddly powerful human element. Think about how we got here. In 1933, a labourer on a bridge project found a skull and, for reasons we can only guess at, fear, superstition, simple instinct, decided not to hand it over. He hid it at the bottom of a well where it sat through war, regime change, famine, revolution, and the entire modern history of paleoanthropology. He died without ever seeing the arguments that his secret would ignite. 90 years later, scientists in climate-controlled labs are scanning that same skull with machines that would have looked like alien technology to him. They're publishing papers in international journals, standing on conference stages, arguing in 3 languages about names and trees and dates. Graduate students who weren't born when the skull left the well are basing their entire careers on questions it raised. Geneticists in other countries are revising their models of Denisovan ancestry, because a fossil from Harbin suggests there might have been more than one northern lineage. Funding agencies are writing calls for proposals shaped, in part, by a decision made at the edge of a bridge in the 1930s. That's what it really means for an object to rewrite history. Not that it erases everything we knew, but that it shifts the questions we ask, the expeditions we plan, the technologies we develop, the stories we tell about ourselves, and the biggest questions Harbin raises still don't have answers. How many ways of being human have we lost? How many lineages left traces in our bones and our blood but no names in our textbooks? How many other skulls are still sitting in wells, caves, riverbanks, and desk drawers, waiting to nudge our story into a new shape? Those are the secrets we're still chasing. Go back one last time to that well. A wooden bucket, a length of rope, a few meters of darkness between the surface and the water. That's all it took to hide one of the most important skulls ever found. Now zoom out. Because in a sense, the whole of prehistory looks like that. Our past isn't a neat museum gallery with everything labelled and lit. It's a landscape full of buried objects, misplaced bones, misidentified fragments, fossils sitting in private houses, tucked into monastery cupboards, locked in provincial storerooms. It's memories turned into legends, legends turned into myths, and then dismissed as stories when they might actually hold faint echoes of real events. The Harbin skull just happens to be one of the rare cases where something climbs back out of the dark and forces us to notice how much is still missing. So where does that leave us if we strip away the hype and stick to what's most credible right now? We can say that Harbin clearly belongs to a big-brained, large-bodied human from the Middle to Late Pleistocene of Northeast Asia. Not a primitive ape-man, not a modern human either, but something in that crowded in-between space. We can say its combination of traits is unusual: the enormous brain case, the thick but arched brow, the low, long skull with a face that's surprisingly flat compared to classic Neanderthals. It doesn't drop neatly into any of the standard boxes. We can say that its age range, as far as current dating allows, overlaps with a time when multiple human lineages almost certainly shared Asia. Neanderthals to the west, Denisovans somewhere to the north and east, early Homo sapiens moving in from the south. We can say that together with other Chinese fossils, Harbin strengthens the idea that Asia was not a side stage. It was a major arena, maybe the major arena, for experiments in being human over the last few 100,000 years. Beyond that, we hit questions. Is it Denisovan? That's plausible, but unproven. Until someone gets ancient DNA or proteins out of a Harbin-like skull, Denisovans remain mostly genetic ghosts, and we're still guessing about their faces. Is Homo longi a real, distinct species? Maybe. Or maybe it's a new label for a branch of a Denisovan grade population we've only just started to see clearly. Or maybe it's part of a broader, messy continuum of archaic humans across Asia that defies our neat species names altogether. Did these people contribute genes directly to some of us alive today? Quite possibly. But which traits, in which populations, from which specific ancestors, is still an active battlefield in genetics papers? And then the biggest unknown of all, how many other Harbin-level surprises are still underground, or sitting in a box or hanging unrecognized on a back shelf? That's the secret we're really chasing. Not just, what is this one skull, but how incomplete is our picture, and what happens to our story each time another piece drops into place. I'd love to hear what you think Harbin represents. Is it the face of Denisovans finally stepping out of the shadows? A fourth major human species that ran alongside us and Neanderthals? Or a reminder that our categories are too simple for a world where lineages split, blur and fuse again over hundreds of thousands of years? Tell your version in the comments. Lay out your theory, what you think this skull was, who it met, how it fits into that web of Ice Age humans. And while you're there, let me know where you're listening from. One of the wildest things about telling these stories is knowing that descendants of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and those African bottleneck survivors are tuning in from every corner of the planet. Drop your city or country below so we can see just how far that ancient network has spread. If you've made it this far, it really helps the channel if you tap like, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into the stranger corners of our past. It's a tiny click for you. But on this side, it makes a huge difference in how many people ever hear about things like a skull in a well that might belong to a lost branch of our family. And if you want to keep wandering through these prehistoric rabbit holes after the video ends, I've put together a whole book of them, from forgotten fossils to vanished migrations and the ghosts still hiding in our DNA. You can read more about it and grab a copy at sleepytimehistory.com, because Harbin won't be the last secret to surface. Somewhere out there right now, a future argument is sleeping in a hillside, a new branch of the family tree is gathering dust in a storeroom, and some ordinary person is walking past a rock face that holds the next skull that will make us redraw our own story. We don't know when those pieces will rise out of their wells, but we can be ready to recognize them when they do.